This is One Nation's response to Labor's budget. My comments will be in two parts. Firstly, an analysis of what Treasurer Jim Chalmers has put into and left out of the budget. Secondly, what a One Nation budget would look like to return Australia into a prosperous country once again. Starting with the measures in Labor's budget for next year, 2024-25. Treasurer Chalmers wants everyone to know about his surplus for this year, 2023-24. Yet his budget released 2 days ago for the coming year, starting in less than 2 months, aims to be a deficit for 2024-25. Many Australians might not know what a surplus is. A surplus simply means that within a given year, the government is spending less than its income. It spends less than what it takes from Australians. Usually that's a good thing. Like any Australian household, government shouldn't be spending more than it has. That's a deficit. Treasurer Chalmers' surplus of just $9.3 billion isn't a happy story, though. It sounds like a big number until you compare it to the total budget spend, $693 billion. Unfortunately, given Treasurer Chalmers' amazing run of good luck, this budget surplus is terrifyingly small. It would be like a family winning Division 1 of Powerball and having $100 left over at the end of the year and calling it a win. There should be rivers of gold flowing into the budget. Instead, we have a miserable trickle because Labor can't resist spending every bit of its lottery winnings. Commodity prices for our exports like oil, gas, coal, metal minerals and agricultural products have all been near or at record levels over the recent few years. That means huge amounts of extra money flowed into Treasurer Chalmers' budget. Oil, gas and coal are all dirty words to this Labor government and its Greens partners, and they're too embarrassed to admit mining and agriculture have largely saved the budget for Australia. The second lottery win for the government is Australian workers. They're working more jobs, longer hours and harder than ever. All of the extra work shows up in the record low unemployment rate. That means more taxes from hard-working Australians are going into the budget coffers than ever before, a record high. Record tax taken from Australians. That's the story of this budget. 3 years of some of the largest tax intakes government has ever had in Australia, ever recorded, yet Labor can only squeeze out the tiniest of surpluses. From this year on, the deficits return, tens and tens of billions of dollars in the red each year, as far as we can see, going deeper into debt. The federal government's debt is due to reach nearly $700 billion in coming years. At the rate this government is going, our children's children will not repay it. Despite working multiple jobs for more hours helping the government bottom line, Australians are still going backwards because of inflation. Inflation is the secret, debilitating stealth tax on all Australians. It's the reason Australia has had the largest collapse of disposable income in the entire OECD. If you feel like you're going backwards, it's because you are. Inflation is leading to tax bracket creep. That means you're earning more while your money is worth less, yet you're paying more tax overall as a percentage. As your income rises with inflation, it takes you into a higher tax rate bracket. The government takes more money from you through bracket creep because of inflation. No wonder they voted against my amendment that would have removed bracket creep. My amendment would have removed the stealth tax. The government is fudging the inflation numbers, making it appear better than the price increases you're actually paying in the real world. When they hand out energy and rent relief, it artificially lowers the inflation figures. This is just papering over the inflation. It does nothing to actually fix it. Economists across the country have slammed Treasurer Chalmers' trickery on this. Without rent assistance, the CPI for rents would have increased 9.5% in the 12 months to March. Instead, because of Treasurer Chalmers' trickery, it was recorded as just 7.8. The cost of electricity has gone up 15% in just a year. The bill relief is papering over that, showing up in the CPI as just 2%. This is a clear, huge admission of failure of the net zero pipe dream. With the most amount of wind, solar and batteries on the grid than ever before in history, Treasurer Chalmers must hand out another round of power bill relief because prices are too expensive. The inflation fight isn't over for Australians who are still going backwards. This budget will pour more fuel on the inflation fire. There are only a few ways to genuinely reduce inflation. First, never repeat the mistake of printing $500 billion out of thin air over COVID. $500 billion. That created much of the inflation we're fighting, as the former head of the Reserve Bank agreed to me. Secondly, reduce the cost of energy, abandoning the net zero pipe dream. While net zero is pushing up power prices, we'll never get rid of inflation. Thirdly, cut the amount of visa holders in the country, now driving huge demand for housing. That's not just a cut to the rate of immigration, as the budget proposes. It needs to be negative, and people need to leave, as I'll explain later. Finally, make investments in productive infrastructure to increase the productive capacity of our country. Assets like dams, power, infrastructure, ports, and rail lines. That's called supply-side economics, improving productivity. That's how inflation can be cut, not with trickery, instead improving real productivity. The next feature item of the Labor budget is their Future Made in Australia plan. This is a vague, unclear collection of weird policy ideas like $1 billion computer and outright scams for a total of $22.7 billion of your money. This will supposedly turn Australia into what they call a green superpower for wind, solar, so-called green hydrogen and other scams. The government will use that money to pick losers that have failed to attract any investment from anyone with common sense in the real world. This is a disaster made in Australia plan. China manufactures and tightly controls more than 80% of all of the critical parts of wind and solar power. Wind and solar make us completely reliant on China for our regular energy needs. Labor's Future Made in Australia will only make that reliance worse. There's no reason to become reliant on wind and solar due to our abundance of oil, gas, coal and uranium in this country. We're the most resource-rich country in the world. Why would we spend tens of billions of dollars ignoring that and handing over control to China? The Future Made in Australia plan is really a Future Made in China plan. This effectively sets up an unsustainable model of business practice which relies on taxpayer subsidies for any meagre profit. What a waste of Australian taxes. Next, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the NDIS. If left unchecked, the NDIS is going to eat this entire country alive. Originally budgeted to only cost $25 billion a year, it will reach $90 billion a year within a decade. Minister Bill Shorten says he can cap the growth at 8% a year, yet it has been growing at 14%. Providers often charge NDIS double or even triple the price for the exact same services. This draws carers to NDIS and drives huge worker shortages in aged care and childcare. The huge NDIS money sink has certainly contributed to this. The NDIS program has been a national shame with unconscionable budget blowouts, widespread rorting, use of taxpayer money for prostitutes and cruises and other scandals, and causes neglect of genuine disability cases. At some point, it's time for Australia to agree this scheme can't be fixed, and it's time to start afresh. Send it back to the states to enable competitive federalism that is proven to drive efficiency and accountability and service. Let's move on to the Future Drought Fund. $519 million. Again, seems a great headline. Just don't read the detail. That money will be split over 8 years, meaning just a tiny $65 million for an industry worth more than $90 billion a year to our country. There's only one real form of drought relief: water. There's not a drop of money in this budget towards a real dam. To get cheaper groceries, we have to grow more of them. We have some of the best farmers in combination with the best soils and climate in the world. Add water, and Australians won't have to worry about grocery bills ever again. A vital part of this budget is the forecast for net overseas immigration. That's how many new people the government expects to take into the country. Australia's net overseas migration was 528,000 people in the 2022-2023 financial year, a historic record, nearly double the previous record. Double! That's like adding a new Canberra to Australia in one go without the political swamp. That's just under 1.5 Sunshine Coasts imported into Australia in just 12 months. The Labor government claims this figure will decrease to 260,000 people a year in 2025-2026. Still way too much. It's a prediction, and like any Labor prediction, don't bet your house on it. Back in October 2022, 4 months into the 12 months budget, they were predicting. The government said net overseas migration would be just 235,000. Just 8 months later, the 528,000 figure blew their forecast out of the water. Way more than double. Was it supreme incompetence or a lie? We'll wait and see if their prediction of 395,000, an entire Sunshine Coast added to the population for this financial year, turns out to be true. If it's not clear, no Australian should trust what a government says when it comes to immigration numbers. It's claimed that the country is just catching up after a slowdown in immigration. That's a lie. It's a lie that's causing a housing crisis, making Australians homeless and feeding inflation. Prior to COVID, there were 1.9 million foreign temporary visa holders in the country likely to require housing. Today, there are 2.3 million. That's 400,000 more people in the country that are fighting Australians for a roof over their head and groceries at the supermarket. Why? To inflate the GDP to get out of the per capita recession. To look good, not do good. Labor doesn't care about the homeless it's causing. That's driven the massive crisis in the rental vacancy rate and huge increases in rents. This Labor government wants to keep adding to that. Another 395,000 projected this financial year, plus 260,000 the following. We don't have enough houses to put these people in. We don't have enough houses to put Australians in. We don't have enough tradies to build enough houses to keep up with the many arrivals. We need to start deporting some visa holders. Net immigration needs to go negative until Australians have got an affordable roof over their head. Perhaps the most important item is something that's completely missing from this Chalmers budget. There's not a single dollar allocated for a royal commission into the COVID response. Millions of Australians were forced to lock down in their homes, forced to take an experimental medical product. Businesses were ruined, children's education ruined, and lives ruined. What's the Labor government's response? Silence. One Nation will continue to fight for a COVID Royal Commission and for perpetrators of human rights abuses to be thrown in jail. That covers some of the things that are in and aren't in Labor's budget. Now I want to talk about a better way, what Australia could look like as a prosperous nation under a One Nation budget. Here are things you won't hear from anyone in the budget, except One Nation, because we've got the guts to say what you're thinking. Firstly, guarantee affordable power. Turn the coal-fired power stations back on. Build more of them and remove solar and wind subsidies. It's the only thing that can save us right now. Cheap power is a matter of life and death for Australians, as many of them are facing the wall in this cost of living crisis. Nuclear should be on the table, and we should simply let the cheapest power win. No handouts or subsidies. Secondly, stop inflation. Stop quantitative easing, printing excess money. $500 billion was concocted out of nowhere during the COVID response. That's a major cause of the inflation we're still fighting today. The former governor of the Reserve Bank, Philip Lowe, the culprit behind that money printing, even agreed with me on that. Thirdly, we'll guarantee cheaper houses, cheaper rents, and get young people into their first home. Don't just cut net overseas migration, start deporting some temporary visa holders. Prior to COVID, there were 1.9 million visa holders who needed housing, fighting Australians for a roof over their head. That's now increased to 2.3 million today, plus 400,000 tourists and others. And we'll ban foreigners from buying Australian property. They're currently snapping up nearly 1 in 10 new Aussie homes. We'll convert the Labor government's designed to fail Housing Future Fund and turn it into the People's Mortgage Fund, issuing fixed-rate 5% mortgages. Fourthly, get cheaper groceries, build dams and help farmers produce tons of fresh, healthy produce for Australians. Give farmers water and the right to use their land. We'll never have to worry about grocery bills again. Fifthly, use all of our natural resources we have right here for Australians first. There's no need to become a green superpower, and we never will. We're already an oil, gas, coal and uranium superpower. Government won't do this because some foreign unelected organisation in Zurich will claim we're not complying with our international obligations. Governments of both sides have forgotten that their first obligation is to Australians, no one else. One Nation knows this. Finally, we must have comprehensive tax reform. The current system is highly destructive to our country and wholesale change must be made. We'll put our trust in Australia's people, release them from the nanny state that tells them everything they can and can't do, and enable people to abound and flourish. That's our promise of what would be a One Nation budget, putting truth, Australia and Australians first to ensure prosperity like we've never seen.